All right. So MPLS end-to-end, a realistic paradigm? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the question that we are going to have for our esteemed panel here tonight. So welcome everyone. I welcome every one of you to the debate on day 2. It's a pleasure to see that there's a lot of you sitting here, which means there's interest in the subject. And I'll really encourage you to participate actively. We hope it will be an interactive session where you will add to the debate with your questions and comments. Telecom services, as we all know, they've been growing rapidly year after year, and the operators are running to catch up. Just as a data point, in the US in 2010 and 2011, the total spending by enterprise and residential customers on telecom services exceeded the capex that the operators spent in laying out their networks. So that gives you a sense of where the operators are. And so the question before operators is, how do we simplify our network operations and run a profitable service while lowering our cost of ownership? And the challenge is before us here is, okay, what paradigms and technologies are available to do that? And in particular, what role does MPLS have in the access and aggregation? We know it's been there in the core and metro, and now we'll bring it to the metro access aggregation segment. And how well can we do with that? That's what we're going to talk about. And we'll focus on that. So it's an honor for me to be here chairing this debate with this august gathering here. I thank the Upper Side team for letting me do that. Just to let you know, my involvement in MPLS goes back to 1998. I've been involved in MPLS technology since then, and with this conference since '99. And in the last many years, my team and I at METANOIA, we've had the privilege of working with small, medium, and large vendors that are looking at MPLS, IP MPLS, and carry Ethernet gear, and we've helped them design, develop, and modify that kind of gear. We've also had the privilege of working with operators in Europe, Asia, North America, and Australia, where we've looked at, again, network strategy for the metro and the access, and what are the technology choices to make that happen. So jumping right into our debate, let's first start by defining, what we mean by end-to-end for the purposes of this discussion. And as I've shown you here, for us, in the wired network, we'll mean from DSLAM or OLT to DSLAM or OLT. And if you're talking about the wireless network, we will mean the MPLS to terminate at the metro aggregation point. So there's no MPLS to customer premise and no MPLS to cell site gateway. And that's just a practical reality to limit the scope of our discussion, and that's how operators are doing it by and large today. And the focus is on transport, MPLS as transport as opposed to MPLS as service, which is something that Kirti had explained in this very venue last year. And we are limiting ourselves to a given operator's domain by and large to keep the discussion simplified. So we have a collection of ecosystem players. We have in Thomas and Christoph here 2 operators of vastly different sizes. And then we have all the standard large vendors which have both IP MPLS and Ethernet gear, Xipeng, George, Hector. And then Yaakov from RAD, which does carrier Ethernet gear, IP MPLS gear in the access and metro. Same for MRV, which also does optical gear. And finally, we have one of the largest integrators in ARICENT, and we have Rajesh from ARICENT representing that viewpoint. So, and what I hope at the end of this is that the value for the audience is we're going to be discussing several important things. And my hope is you'll take away maybe some motivations for why service providers consider MPLS end-to-end, the economics of the solutions, some trade-offs involved, technical maturity, scalability, security. We hope to cover some of these subjects in the hour that we have. And the hope is that you can utilize some of the insights as inputs for your own network evolution plans or product evolution strategy. So let me kick it off by asking a question of the audience. So how many people here are from the service providers? Who here works for a service provider? Could you please raise your hands? OK, that's a fair number. So now, how many out of you are currently evaluating technologies or options for your metro or access network evolution? Could you please raise your hands? All right, so I would say, almost all of the people who raise their hands, at least 80% or 70% are currently looking at evolving their metro and access network. So that's great. So with that, I think the first question that we need to ask the panel is, what are the motivations for an operator to even think about MPLS end-to-end or other technologies? And for that, I'm going to turn to Thomas and Christoph. And I'll request maybe starting with Christoph and then with Thomas to take maybe a couple minutes each to give us the top 2 or 3 motivations that you had as you began to look at MPLS for your network end-to-end.
OK. When we started to look at MPLS end-to-end, we saw our access network and then aggregation networks, metro networks, to grow constantly, and we had scalability problems in those parts of our network. And And we also started to sell services to our customers that went from one access network to the other access network. So we needed some way of combining, having a way to send packets from one network to the other without having all these, having to configure every single point where we go from the access to the core network and back to the access network. So that's one reason why we did this. And another motivation for us was we saw, okay, we can run an IP MPLS network very well in the core. Why not extend it to the edge of the network, and to can use the same tools that we were using for the backbone, and so this is one other motivation for us.
Okay, wonderful. And I'll just add that Silver Server is one of the largest ISPs in Austria, but they don't do mobile backhaul. They are dedicated to doing Ethernet services in the wireline environment, right? And your geographic
Yes.
scope is within Austria.
Yes.
So that's important to keep in mind as you think about some of the discussions here. And then, of course, everybody knows Deutsche Telekom, so I don't need to introduce them. And we'll have Thomas talk a little bit about what their motivations were.
Okay, I'm Thomas Beckhaus, and I also did a presentation regarding the seamless MPLS. And after the last presentation, I'm very happy that there are 3 vendors between Yaakov and me. So I think I'm a little bit limited with the scope of this end-to-end, because I'm still an old ITM guy, and I expect also MPLS down to the desktop. Every customer should set up an LSP to Google and so on to get into the internet. But to be honest, today we define our end-to-end, it's different, very different, because Deutsche Telekom is very large, different requirements, we run different networks, and at least in our common platform for business services, wholesale services, and residential services, we now define the end-to-end from the access node to the access node. As I've presented in the presentation earlier, it does not mean that we have to add any access node to the network, but most of them should be added because of the requirements. The requirements are not because MPLS provides such a wonderful quality of service functionality. We are very happy with IP quality of service functionality. We also don't want to provide MPLS because of scalability, because IP scales much better than MPLS, and we have to solve a lot of scalability issues in our seamless MPLS approach. And I think it's 50% of the work we have to do with the seamless MPLS approach. The main motivation, at least for Deutsche Telekom, is that we want to have one common network layer protocol in the network. We want to be sure that we can provide end-to-end services without configuring some nodes within the network, and also consider these nodes in the network regarding redundancy, load balancing, and so on. So to move everything onto the transport level, and services only on the service level. That's the main motivation in our network today to implementing seamless MPLS. And this motivation is also based on our experience with our Mac and Mac-based aggregation network, where we have a lot of configuration, a lot of changes also in the network, and that means we have to configure every node in the network. And I think the impact depends really on your strategy regarding single source, multi-source, or multi-vendor scenarios in your network. If you want to have a multi-vendor scenario, and a very flexible multi-vendor scenario, we have got a lot of problems with reconfiguring your network, and any change in the network, it's a real mess for all the configuration. And for this task, we expect to move MPLS down to the access nodes, that we have one common network level, and everything should be provided by the network level, the connectivity part of them. And we only have to provide the services end-to-end. In some cases, the other end is the other access node, for example, for E-line services. But in many other cases, the other end is, for example, a powerful Loibl edge router implemented into the seamless MPLS, which terminates the pseudo-wire and provides an IP service on top of this pseudo-wire or layer 2 service, but also the BRS functionality for our residential customers. And therefore, the main motivation for the seamless MPLS approach is to get a much better understanding, a much better possibility for operate the services. And for many cases, we are also aware that we add a lot of complexity, a lot of functionality into the network, but we think it's worth to implement it.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
There's 3 people between us, so don't be afraid. You know, I really understand your point about calling it seamless, because you're saying, okay, we have Ethernet being passed off, but that's like a service level. And we want a single network like MPLS in between. So you have Ethernet to MPLS, and the other side Ethernet again, and it sounds simple. But as you said before, there are various problems putting the control protocols in, scalability, et cetera. Now, if we come back a few years from now, we're going to have IPv6 interfaces on one side, IPv6 on the other. Are we going to have another panel on seamless IPv6, get rid of everything, and just have one single network? Think about it. We have the control protocols. It's nice and secure. It scales. Once we get the problem of doing entries or Pamelas for these giant addresses down, and that's going to happen. Remember, MPLS, the original reason, I can ask George here, was to speed up forwarding, but by the time it got there, we were doing IP forwarding faster than the MPLS. That'll happen to V6 also. So we're preparing the next panel for seamless V6, and that's the entire solution?
I think the IPv6 seamless IPv6 scenario would be the best one if you only provide IP services, IPv6 services, don't have any requirements for VPN services. If you have VPN services, you need partitioning of the network. And there you have to consider what is the best solution for that.
Excellent, yeah.
So Cisco had a short delay in getting an OC48 card out, and for a moment we considered using MPLS to speed it up. That rumor got all over the place, and we found it very convenient to leave that rumor floating around while we went off and did what we really wanted to do with it.
All right, so you know, what we are learning is that it depends very much on the requirements of the operators. It can vary, and you know, there can be different motivations. But then, I guess one other thing that still one wants to consider is the economics of doing a solution that for the metro and the edge. I mean, clearly cost is very, very important. So now MPLS end-to-end is one option, but you know, there are other options. Obviously, Yaakov talked about Ethernet and so on. I wonder what the panel thinks about the trade-offs involved in these different solutions from a cost perspective, because really that's also an important consideration.
I think that up to now, most of the networks that we see eventually still using Ethernet on the access side. This is the reality. MPLS is getting more, in terms of economics, closer to the aggregation part, first mile aggregation. But again, there is a sense, and you mentioned about scalability. It's not about only scalability of the size of the dimension of the network itself, but sometimes we're speaking about issues like the explosion of MAC addresses. And this is the issue, which means if you take any layer 2 network without the right configuration, I could shut down the network in 60 seconds. So MAC explosion is also one of the issues that really threatening, and the PBB was one of the solutions to resolve those VPLS islands and not to populate them with all the relevant or irrelevant MAC addresses. But the fact of economics is, again, today most of the silicon, the ASICs, already have the possibility to really extend the MPLS up to the DMARC device. So what we'll see is eventually a cost structure that is reasonable to extend the MPLS to the access. And access point typically will not require a lot of multi-point configuration. Depends, again, on the network. But this is typically multiple of dozens connection and not necessarily supposed to learn the whole network. So the economics are there. If you're looking today on the devices that can extend the MPLS to the access of the network, it's reasonable. In terms of operational efficiency, it's really there, which means you can configure destination IP address of MPLS, and you can define it as a loose or strict path, and it's really there. So you can bind it to the relevant operation center and the operation processes, and it's actually supposed to simplify it, rather configuring each node of VLANs all the way up to the first aggregation of MPLS. So
let's hear Hector. I think he has a viewpoint.
So I would like to mention that we have multiple type of operators. We have mobile operators, we have incumbent operators, we have transport operators, and there is no one single solution that fits all. So more specifically for the incumbent operators like Deutsche Telekom, today there is a benefit in doing, for example, bringing MPLS directly up to the service node. So talking about the seamless MPLS approach. Because today it is about provisioning 2 nodes. It is very well understood, but you need to be provisioning 2 nodes every time. And as well about the resiliency of these schemes. So by simplifying this interconnection, putting MPLS, it brings a lot of benefits from the OpEx perspective. Now we can extend it as well for the other areas on the axis. Yet there will be other operations, like for example, if we go into the mobile operators space, and more specifically for mobile backhaul, In many cases, there will be administrative domains that even if the technology allows to have this interconnection and seamless MPLS connectivity just for the administrative domain, it's not possible. But there is a lot of benefits from the OpEx perspective.
Actually, we